Hello, Cardstack community. I'm Chris C., the founding director of the Cardstack project, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, I'm joined by Koii Lab CEO Al Morris to talk about a topic dear to my heart, decentralized publishing infrastructure. Thinking about how the attention economy that has been led astray by Web2 companies can be rethought in the Web3 as an ingredient to create, incentivize, and meaningful, and more importantly, fun and productive way of sharing what we learn, know, and love on the internet. Welcome, Al.
Hey, Chris, great to be on the show.
Well, this is something that I really like to kind of talk about because right now in the world of Web3 and Web2, we are looking at Twitter, which is a content publishing attention economy type of platform, looking at some possibility, both in terms internally and externally. And there's competitors that's coming back. And obviously Web3 competitors who say, hey, social network can be done in a decentralized way. Meanwhile, we continue to have the web economy kind of going along and NFT economy introduce new primitives and figuring out how that fits together. So it's really interesting to have you kind of give us share some light of your unique perspective of what you believe decentralized publishing and that kind of content attention economy would do. Can you tell us a little bit about what your journey in Web3 is and how you led you to this idea to work on Koii to build this decentralized network?
Yeah, I'll get into that in a second. I think the Twitter use case is kind of an interesting example, though. So one of the things that's really noteworthy about Twitter or any of these platforms is at some point, someone has to pay the hosting bill, right? There's all this data. Every time a new user comes to them for free, they've got to upload some content. And every single time that one of those little uploads goes through, it's got to get stored somewhere, potentially indefinitely, because most users expect that their content will always be available. And so that means that every day the hosting bill increases, and it always will. Which is really strange, right? Like it's like kind of a very odd perpetual machine that's always going to have to exist there. And what this ends up doing is it means that whoever pays that hosting bill has to find a way to take some revenue out to keep paying that bill. And I think that's the big debate at the end of the day. No matter how you look at it, there's this big revenue that's needed to cover the hosting bills and to cover the cost of the engineers that keep the platform secure. And that's the big nut we've been trying to crack. I got into this because I was, at one point I was a robotics engineer. So I did industrial automation and designed like fairly large production systems. And then as I was in that industry for a while, I started thinking technology could be used, possibly at a bigger scale through looking at communication systems. So the kind of thing I noticed was essentially that if I was automating factories or figuring out how to do really complicated workflows that would produce good machinery or good people or good products, whatever it was that was coming out the other end of the factory, the question was always, who was going to make the big budget decision so that we could implement the system that we had in mind. And that ends up at the end of the day, it's like a fairly democratic process, right? Whether you're looking at how a large company makes decisions or how a country makes decisions on what sort of industries it subsidizes, it comes down to speech and communication. So I got out of that and I got into the digital marketing world. I designed tracking pixels and worked on basically advertising systems for a while. And I started seeing how that's how the publishing industry works. And these were mostly small publishers that we were working for. So we had an ad network and we were providing all the tools that somebody would need to monetize their WordPress website. Being able to send affiliate links and have promotions tracked and be able to track rewards that were getting calculated based on how many kind of click-throughs there were to go and buy something from the store. Right. And around that same time, I started seeing how that industry was running and started getting kind of concerned by the amount of information that was being perpetrated that ended up seeming kind of hokey, right? Like affiliate marketing at the end of the day is very much like it's almost an incentive model for false advertising. So like a company has a product they want to sell and they give the nitty gritty to their engineering team to go build the thing and get it out there. And then on the other side, they've also got a list of selling points and a bunch of affiliates who are getting paid commission to make those selling points attractive to customers. And so the way that an affiliate makes the selling points attractive to customers is very seldom checked, especially if the affiliate's bringing in a lot of revenue for the company, right? They're not going to go to them and say, hey, you're not saying this right. You left out these key points about our product. If it's working, they're probably going to reward the affiliate more and actually try to get them to sell more product. And so I started seeing that side of that industry and I started looking at ways to peer review the internet. One of the things we were trying to do at the time, back in 2016, was to crowdsource a peer review of the web. Especially around that election cycle in the US, there was a lot of kind of crazy ideas flowing around. So we wanted to have a way for people to leave a comment saying, hey, this article that you're reading may have some misinformation in it, or it might just be powered by affiliate links. Like I noticed that there's an affiliate link here. Maybe you should watch out when you click this. Maybe it's not completely trustworthy. And that went pretty well. We had a small Chrome extension with a decent community around it. And then we started looking for ways to pay those people. So I started organizing Ethereum and Bitcoin meetups back in the very early days. And that just kind of like snowballed to the point where I ended up running into an Ethereum co-founder who liked the educational work that we were doing around the space and actually gave me and a couple of friends the ability to build a teaching school in Chicago. I say teaching school, it sounds silly, but we basically had people coming in and doing classes and just teaching them about crypto. We weren't charging them at all. It was totally a nonprofit activity, but we were teaching everybody from, like fifth graders right up to grandmothers, everyone in between.
That's an interesting journey, like, because you have actually, arrived at this having been kind of solving those problems. I think one of the things in crypto is that there's an easy way to say, hey, the people who are working on this new economic model on Web3 never done it in the previous way. Well, when you have done it, you've seen how Tracking Pixel works, you have done, this monetization for like e-commerce affiliate, then that's the reality. The truth is Shopify and even Facebook is that business model just scaled up, right? So what do you see is the learning from those kind of Web2 monetization activity, the hosting bill being something we'll get to when we talk about infrastructure a little bit, but from like the revenue generation and getting people incentivized to do, what do you think is something that the Web3 people don't appreciate about those network? Call it the underbelly of the internet, if you would, but that's what pays for most things you see on the internet. Like, is there something that Web2 and Web3 engineering with a purer, maybe some of the people new in their career don't see that you see coming from both of those fields, be able to make that projection?
So one of the things I see a lot in crypto is that the internal economy of crypto is very much powered by people selling crypto. And I think that that's actually kind of the opposite of how it should be working. So if you look at the Web2 economy, there's this sort of, it's almost like an assumed fact that, like, as you said, the ads are what's powering most of the content. And then the ads exist because you can go to a website somewhere like a Shopify website, or even like a Spotify and set up a credit card, or some website that's powered by Stripe where you can make a quick payment. Or back in the day, like what Elon actually got famous for was PayPal, right?
PayPal, yeah.
So being able to make a payment online was a huge deal. And as soon as the internet got over that hump where there was something that someone wanted to pay for on the internet and the ability to pay for it, then it got really big. And we don't actually have that in crypto right now. There's no real internal economy for the most part. There's not a lot of like high user activity websites. Most of the users and wallets right now are using them to buy crypto as an investment, or they're using them to buy NFTs, which is also an investment, but nobody's really using the tech. And when we see people get to that point where they're purchasing things inside the crypto economy, they're actually driving value. That's what's going to make a big difference. So
the speculation, the opposite of speculation is consumption, right? You have to be consumptive with it. The thing has to lead to something being consumed, not lead to, I'll buy a sneaker, but I'm going to flip it later on versus I'm going to buy a sneaker and I'm going to wear it. And there's a big difference between those two use cases. And the marketplace do differ. Some of them overlap a little bit. Some neighborhood shops that do both, but typically it bifurcates into Foot Locker and some like fancy schmancy shop where the whole thing is in a shrink wrap and you never actually open it.
I want to repeat that again in case anybody wasn't listening. I love that idea, actually. The opposite of an investment is consumption.
The opposite of speculation is consumption.
That's a really good one. That's like very quotable, actually. I might quote it.
Awesome.
I
think it's really important that we consume real goods and services using crypto well, and that has not happened. I agree with you.
Right. And I think so the transition towards being a more stable economy as well, I think, in crypto is going to happen when speculation evens out with consumption.
Yes.
Because at that point, the consumption feeds the speculation. And then we can see this kind of like ongoing growth, which would be much more organic than what's happening now. Like what's happening now, like as we saw with the FTX thing, right? It's very forced, right? FTX was backing Alameda to make all these early stage investments. And then they're just pumping all these prices, right? And that's what's been happening in crypto for ages. I mean, if you look at the early Ethereum days, the token price was getting pumped by people who were close to it. If you look at the early days of Bitcoin too, same kind of thing happening, right? Like once some new group of bankers enters the fold and has to pump it up enough to make money off of their exchange. And sometimes that doesn't work out. Like with Quadriga, it didn't work out at all. So like if anybody's looking for a great Netflix documentary to watch, the documentary on Quadriga is fantastic.
What's it called?
Quadriga is the name of the exchange. Oh, okay. I'm not too sure exactly what the name. I'll look it up really quick.
Of the Netflix
Quadriga show documentary. Yeah, that was a spectacular one. Quadriga CX documentary gets it right. Trust No One: The Hunt for the Crypto King.
Trust No One, yeah.
It's a spectacular documentary. It shows what happens when these exchanges blow up. I think we're going to see that pretty shortly with FTX as well.
Oh, for sure.
There's just a lot of money missing. Or if you look at what happened with Terra Luna, right? Same kind of thing. Money just disappears, poof, into thin air. And then we're left with a bunch of people asking a lot of questions. And most of the time that happens because it's kind of like this internal Ponzi scheme. So our commitment at Koii, just to counteract this a little bit, is usually that we want to see massive network activity on testnet before we're going to launch the mainnet.
Yeah.
So right now we've got this kind of pipeline process for our ecosystem projects. Anybody who's building on Koi's tech, we try to get them in front of lots of investors, help them grow, help them learn. But the idea being that they're going to use Koi's network to pay end users to run nodes that provide services. So as opposed to them buying tokens or selling tokens, they're not doing any of that until they've actually got a product that's running on this decentralized network of computers they're creating.
Yeah.
Which is,
That
it's
makes
a
a lot
very
of
different
sense.
services-based economy compared to a lot of what's happening.
And I think people don't realize that, so much of the Web2 economy is some developer paying fees and some people running nodes, and some of them are big, AWS, and some of them are smaller, like shops, especially outside of the data centers in the major kind of Western cities. You pay for services, whether there's running software for you in open source stack or, some nodes that's unique with your local compliance. What are you seeing people running as these nodes? Like, what are the services? We think about blockchain is about block creation, maybe running some nodes for some relay services. What are the unique type of activity that are worth paying for on the Koii network?
So there's a really interesting thing that has happened where it used to be that you had to run your own server, right? Like when Facebook started up, like if you listen to Chamath Palihapitiya on podcasts, he's often talking about like back in the early days, Facebook had to like have a room full of computers on racks. And that was where all the data was. And now they've got data centers. And actually, when a lot of these big companies built out their data centers, they built over capacity. And so they can rent out the excess capacity to people, which they make a fortune on.
Right.
AWS is probably I think it's like 50% of Amazon's profits, maybe even more than that.
It seems like it.
And so that kind of stuff is really, really effective. And AWS is Amazon Web Services for people who aren't right up on it. But so one of the things that happened here is that as you got to the point where you're paying somebody else to use their computer, you were paying to use a big computer, just like you would have had in your house, right? But that's actually really expensive because now you're paying for a data center, which has some oversight staff, usually an electrical bill. They're expensive to build because they have to be kind of out in the middle of nowhere next to a data center line. Like there's a big like fiber optic cable going through the ground that somebody's got to maintain. So there's all this stuff going on, right? And so that is quite a bit more expensive than putting a computer in your basement. Like almost probably like at least 2 times as expensive. And then it gets marked up to 5 times. And Amazon will give you a nice break on it for the first year when you're a young startup, but then you start having to pay that bill. So like, many startups I know are paying 50, 80K a month. If you look at Snapchat, I think they're paying 1.5 billion a year or something like that to AWS, which is insane.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so these prices go up and up and up. And then what you start looking at is like, okay, is this big computer that we're renting in this big Costco looking warehouse that's really, really spec'd out the best way to do all of our compute? Or do we only need it for some things? Right. And it's possible that maybe we only need it for some things. And maybe there's a bunch of stuff that you could use home computers for. And so that's a lot of the conversations we're having with these people that are trying to do kind of use the tasknet infrastructure is like, maybe you don't need to decentralize everything you're doing, but maybe there's some stuff that you could be using more computers for that's a bit lower cost hardware where you can start giving back to your community. And the cool thing about that too is that then the community that's actually helping host this thing is getting paid by the app they're using. So like, let's say I really care about launching a decentralized social media network. Maybe all of my users now might also care about that a lot too. And so maybe we can get enough hosting together that we can bring down that cost of all that hosting and we can use our computers to host a lot of it. And now we don't need as much advertising. So we aren't as beholden to the bottom line and trying to get other money in. And we're not as focused on revenue. We're more focused on, sharing ideas and connecting with each other. And so like, just to answer your point broadly in the crypto ecosystem, what we're seeing with tasks a lot is things like bridging between blockchains. So if you need to watch one blockchain, take data and then write it to another blockchain, that's something you can get a bunch of home computers to do. It's actually better to do it that way too. So if you just have one big computer doing it and that big computer gets compromised, it can be really dangerous. But if you get 10,000 home computers to do it, you can do pretty inexpensive stuff, right? Transaction fees on Polygon and other networks are getting a lot cheaper. And so if you have a whole bunch of computers that are watching this thing, you can get like 10,000 transactions, batch them together onto IPFS, submit one transaction to submit that CID that represents 10,000 transactions that are on decentralized storage. And then everybody's basically committed to saying this thing is supposed to happen on this chain. And so you can create really, really secure bridges with that, which is incredibly powerful because then each blockchain does what it's supposed to do. And you can access services from one blockchain ecosystem on another ecosystem. And it's a great way to integrate things like decentralized storage, like Filecoin as well. So we're starting to work a lot with companies like the call I had right before this that maybe a little bit late was with Web3.storage. It's Web3.storage.
Yes.
And they're basically implementing a lot of systems to make Filecoin data more available to people. So they do all the caching for you and you just kind of pay them to keep the file uploaded. Well, who's going to pay the file to keep it uploaded? You need somebody to actually make that account and pay for it. So if you get a bunch of coin nodes to go do that for you, now you have a decentralized way of managing a centralized API to manage decentralized storage.
Right.
But it's convenient because those node operators can now pay with a credit card, and then they can get paid in crypto for having managed the task. So there's sort of a balance to these things. It's like integrating Web 2 and Web 3 as well. So if you need somebody to go fetch data off a website, that's where we started out with web scraping and kind of not censoring the internet, but peer reviewing it, censoring bad speech, essentially. So a lot of those types of applications, like if I need 50,000 computers to go gather data off the internet to write a search engine that's decentralized, you can do that with Koii. So we're seeing a lot of different adoption of these things. And then the other side of it's just like social media networks have a lot of backend functionality, right? So if you want to upload a photo and then have it show up on thousands of devices with different screen sizes in the optimal format for their bandwidth connection, maybe you need, 50,000 computers to crunch that data. So you've got this one like 2 megabyte image. Maybe you just want to show somebody a 1 kilobyte image, a really small thumbnail. And you do all these compressions to different sizes, store them all into decentralized storage. And then when the user is actually viewing that content, they get the right size image for their device, which in Web 2 is really easy to do because you've got all these giant data centers. But in Web 3, it's pretty hard. And it turns out, though, that if you use 50,000 home computers for that, it's actually a lot cheaper than using a data center for it.
Right. So and the conversion, a lot of these things, I mean, famously, one of the company, MHIX or ImageX or something like that, they were just racking like Macs, and because Apple has built in really good image compression that's high quality than the ImageMagick or this kind of like Linux-based library, and they were like, you know what, let's get the best software, which happens to be in this hardware, and they just did a mechanical task of figuring out how to put Mac Pros on the rack. There was a time they would look like trash cans, so it was not an easy problem. But yeah, if you have a Mac at home, let's say an M1 Mac Mini, that's like 17 times the processing power of that Mac Pro trash can back in the days, right? So I agree that the operation of decompressing a JPEG hasn't changed in 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and there's another interesting example on that line is if you build a binary, which is like the file that your computer actually runs when it runs an application, you take all the source files and then you need to build it on a machine that has the same hardware specs, the same processor, that kind of thing. Like we run into this when we deploy our desktop nodes, we need to build them on a bunch of different devices. So if you want to task that out to somebody, hey, here's a whole bunch of different devices running every operating system on every type of hardware, and they're all ready for you. So you don't need to go hire some data center to keep those all running. It's just a bunch of community members that are out there. And you can still verify the build because you get 2 of them to do it, and then the build still has the same hash. It's all good.
Right.
One of the interesting things, actually, we didn't really get into this part of it, but the big problem with this distributed computing stuff is this idea of replications. And so that basically means like, if I don't necessarily trust you, like if I have a data center with, AWS, I can pretty much trust that it's going to run properly because Jeff Bezos probably isn't trying to put his finger on the scale.
Right.
But if I give you a job to do with your computer, how do I trust that you did the thing correctly? Right. That's like a huge issue, right? Then how do I make it easy for you to make yourself trustworthy to me as well, right? And so what we talked about is a lot of like the replication factor. So the replication factor of 2 means 2 computers have to do each job. And so that means the network is running at 50% capacity by default, right? So the value of the network is lower. So what we actually invented to fix this is this idea of a CARP, compute and reputation protocol. And so that's why it's called Koii, because Koii is a type of CARP.
Very nice.
But the cool thing about a compute and reputation protocol is that as opposed to staking tokens to run a task, you're basically staking more reputation than tokens, ideally.
And reputations are earned by correctly performing the tasks over time?
Exactly. Or having standing in the community. So a big part of why Koii is an attention economy, all of our inflation, so all the growth of new tokens that occur goes to people who get attention from other people with content, right? And so if you have a high reputation, which I imagine you do, got a pretty good show, then more people watching you who also have a high reputation, who are all running nodes, means we should trust you more. And so you get a boost in your reputation along with getting those tokens, because all of those community members who run nodes are reliable members of the community as well. And we can watch all the signatures coming from their wallets to say, hey, this content he's making is awesome.
Yeah, what's really interesting about it is that the page rank, which is how page links to me, links to other thing, makes the thing more possible, is such a good model. But page rank is so hard to implement in smart contract, right? Because it's just a completely different type of computational mechanism and the way you schedule and kind of go through the network and stuff like that. But it actually is the best way to figure out if I trust this. No, Sybil resistance can be kind of looked at as a page rank problem, like spam pages can be, shaked out by looking at the link capability. And it is a little bit of I think, a gap between the programming model of smart contracts and this type of analytic model that underlies a lot of reputation system that are in production today, in the thing that we use every day.
Like, oddly enough, this is a big reason why we implemented CARP and gradual consensus. Because to do something like PageRank, you actually have to do a lot of comparative analysis. And
Right.
blockchains are very bad at that. Like most
No,
blockchain
absolutely.
nodes, like if you look at Ethereum right now, right, like sharding is going to fix this, obviously. But at the moment, most of the transactions are being replicated across 2,000 nodes.
Mm-hmm.
So your replication factor isn't 2, it's 2,000. That's
Yes.
why the gas fees can cost a lot of money, right? The way Polygon fixes this is they have kind of subnets for different sections of the network. So you're only replicating it that many times.
Mm-hmm.
But what you don't have is bespoke replication factors for each type of task that you're doing.
Yeah.
And so in Koii, you can set the replication factor you think is necessary. You can set the weightings to figure out how many people need to vote before something gets confirmed. And you do this on a task by task basis. So if you think that what you're doing doesn't require as many replications, or if you only invite people that have a high enough reputation, you can cut down on that compute, the excess compute by a significant margin.
Yeah.
But also, we also use this node network to calculate who gets which reputation as well. And so we're working on making that system even more efficient as well.
So let's say you want to use a task to determine the affiliate revenue that you're going to pay out to a bunch of people to help you sell some new sneakers. And one of the person who is selling sneakers is like, oh, I'm 95% of all the thing, and that's a lie. They just kind of create it. How do you kick that person out if they submit a result? Let's say they somehow infiltrate the node and get selected through reputation or other means, that the answer is self-serving, is wrong. How's it compared to, let's say, as compared to the other 45 people who runs this? So what is the way of kind of finding that majority report in the minority report opposite sense?
Of course. So there's two types of audits, basically. So gradual consensus is the system we implemented. And how that works is you have several periods of operation. You have a round where all the nodes are doing a job. And then at the end of the round, there's a submission period where they can submit a result to try and get paid. And they can ask to have some of the reward pool based on having submitted some kind of result. Yeah. And then there's a period after that called the audit period where we check the results that were submitted on chain, which once they're submitted on chain, they're locked in. You can't change anything, right? Yep. And then after that, we start going and verifying that the thing that was locked in on chain during the submission period is valid. And so the rest of the nodes have some time to say, hey, this submission doesn't look right. And then so the question then is, how do you tell a good submission from a bad submission? Right. That's what we call an audit. And so there's different types of audits. So if you're doing something like web scraping, you don't want to weight the node's voting power too significantly. You don't want to give them too much extra voting power for anything like if they stake more tokens or they have a higher reputation, their voting power.
Because it's gameable.
Because it's gameable, because it has to be voted on, right? And similarly, if you're doing random number generation, you also don't want to do too much weighting. What you do want to do is over time, you want to track how often somebody seems to be getting staked out or focused on as an audit. And you get to see a little bit if they're kind of continuously misbehaving and kind of rank them down. There are, though, a lot of cases where there are deterministic actions which can always be audited without any kind of voting or any kind of like popularity contest attitude. Right. And so in a lot of those cases, like verifying that something is pinned on IPFS, right? If I say that I pinned something on IPFS and then the network, like a whole bunch of nodes query it and they don't see it there, then it's really easy to tell that it didn't happen. Or better yet, if I say that I did some complex math task, like add up these 500 numbers that are all really large, right? Somebody else could just do it. And then if everybody else all does it and they all see that I'm lying and they all submit a vote on chain, then it becomes fairly easy to tell that I lied.
So you're not actually looking at the envelope of submission. You're kind of looking at showing the envelope to other people and kind of have them grade each other and say, hey, this is the person who's cheating. And through that, some sort of democratic or not democratic based on kind of the economic model that will make sense. That's really cool. I think this idea of having solving the Oracle problem beyond this really simple, I know the temperature on chain at this particular time, where I can think of like 7 use cases of it, but it is about it, right? Like you do have to have some interpretation on more complex data set. And sometimes the only people who can interpret the data is the people who actually ran the data themselves. So it is still a little bit of peer review. That's a fascinating look at what type of decision can be made on chain versus off chain with either people or algorithm. In some cases, mostly people.
The one thing that's really cool about this is the proof sets can actually be extremely large because there's a few ways you can distribute the proofs, right? Like I can host a REST API on my node and I can let you download the proofs from me. And if I submitted something on chain and I don't let you download the proofs, you lose. That's true. Right? If you don't let me access the file, then I can take your stake away because I couldn't access the file. And similarly, I can also, I can put the data on IPFS. And I can take like a 2 gigabyte file and put it on IPFS, and everybody else can download it from there. So none of these proofs need to be submitted on chain for the most part. This is an idea that was originally popularized by the Mimblewimble team. They were doing this idea with, and they had a token as well called Beam. And the idea there was like kind of like kernel jumping. So you'd have like, instead of having a blockchain, you just have a current state that was verified, and then you'd move to the next one, and then you'd move to the next one, right? And so you don't actually have to store all the historical data. You also don't have to store all the proofs. So you can kind of just move from one state to the next.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these ideas have gone around in the crypto community for a while. I probably didn't explain them very well for anybody who's listening.
That part is very clear, and I mean, there's a lot more than that when you're trying to make a full system. It was good that we have an opportunity to talk a little bit about like that off-chain compute and how that fits in. There was a couple of days ago. In the drama of Twitter and the reorganization going on there, Elon Musk tweeted a diagram about this is how your home timeline comes to. We mix ads and other things together, and there's a recommendation engine coming from there, and we insert ads and try to make something relevant to you, and then we're refactoring from this old system to the new system. I think it's the first time people see like these timelines in newsfeed, how they come up. And, it's really interesting to compare and kind of deconstruct this like behemoth of Twitter in a bunch of microservices, which by the way is a lot of how these scalable systems are built. To me, looking at this particular situation, some of those tasks that is being kind of like surfacing your feeds and stuff like that, couldn't those be tasks that people can run by looking at IPFS and these raw feeds, or the type of like publishing that you do on your own blog or IPFS, and try to like, run some sort of ranking algorithm and compare the ranking algorithm with each other, that you've, fulfilling some sort of algorithmic accuracy?
Yeah. So indexing would be what we call that. And that's a highly verifiable and highly deterministic task. Which is pretty cool. The only exception to that is when you're looking at a significantly large data set where there's latency concerns, because then your node and my node might not see the same data set.
I see.
And so then there's a limitation to how much you can index reliably, because the amount of time that it would take to verify what you're doing, the data set might change. So you need snapshots of the data set over time. But that, in most cases, you can do indexing pretty deterministically. And you also don't need to audit people every time. And so if you audit people like 1 in 10 times and they seem to be mostly doing it accurately, you can kind of trust that the node is operating correctly. We kind of see it as like there are like two types of people in the world. There's people who will opportunistically take advantage of a system, and there's people who will play by the rules because they want the game to continue playing. You can kind of actually, there's a great book called Finite and Infinite Games that gets into a lot of details on that, but it's kind of like the Uber driver or Airbnb host thing. Like if somebody has a good rating on Uber, you can pretty much trust that nothing bad's going to happen in their car, right? They're not going to get into a car accident. They're not going to try to like steal from you. You're probably okay. And the same thing applies to Airbnb hosts. Like if somebody's been operating with Airbnb for 5 years and it's still the same person running the account, it's pretty safe that they're a good person. So we see like compute operations as a very similar thing for that. And, Filecoin implements this a bit with Filecoin host, or like the storage that they do as well. It's kind of a similar process.
I think that there's a little bit of the metrics. It's differ in each of the different type of execution. Like file storage has a certain type of signals, and you can decide on what signal is more meaningful. Obviously, getting these node runner to run in consensus is one layer of the stack. Getting users to do the type of activity that enriches the kind of the web, right? The content experience on the other side. At the end of the day, publishing is about interesting stuff that you want to read versus just a great scalable system to organize things that you don't want to read or you don't want to engage with. So, crypto introduces incentive system, which hopefully it would go beyond just incentivizing miners and farmers to do these mechanical clicking tasks that they don't really pay attention to anything. They just try to get through the quest and try to enhance the lottery ticket chance of getting an airdrop. What type of incentives do you think is missing in Web3 that exist in Web 2 that would be buildable on top of the primitive that you've suggested? Like what kind of incentive for actual content contribution do you think is possible?
So in terms of content contributions, I think there's an expansion actually beyond Web 2 in a big way. So we have this, we wrote a white paper called the Content Collectives paper. And we see this idea of like, as opposed to online communities being beneficiary mostly to the platform, if they're beneficiary to the end users have a much greater incentive to curate the content. And so the general idea is who's a better curator of your newsfeed? Elon Musk and a bunch of devs at Twitter, or the guys who are making the content that you like. And so if I could get the top 10 people who I follow to all curate a feed for me, and they could do it without working too hard, and they could just input some suggestions and help kind of tune the algorithm over time, the outcome of that feed, which is slightly curated and not algorithmic to everybody that's using the platform, is actually a significantly better, it would be a significantly better stream of information. And it would also be probably a better preservation of my own rights to kind of control what I'm actually looking at, right?
Right.
Because one of the big things that you give up when you use these platforms is you're no longer kind of curating your own feed, which I would say is like the worst case scenario of that is what's happened to like broadcast journalism. Like if you look at the news, like I was at the dentist earlier today, and they have a TV above you while they're in your mouth, right? And the TV
culture
has
shock,
the news
right?
on,
Like what is going on here?
But they always have the news on. And then when I go in, I have to ask them to turn the news off. But it's like everybody else who sits in that chair gets this curated stream of things that BBC or whoever they've got on wants to see. And that's actually not great either, right? Like you really don't want somebody else curating all of your information streams, because that means you don't have any personal control of what ideas you're ingesting. And even with Twitter, like you follow people, but you might not see the posts from the people that you follow. You might be seeing posts from the people who are trending or who are kind of closely related to the ads that they want you to click on or whatever it is, right? And at some point, there is a rationalization where Twitter is making certain choices that are beneficial to them and not necessarily to you. And they want to, like, obviously, they would like to tread that line towards being beneficial to you and them. But there's kind of like a Venn diagram there of things that are beneficial to you that aren't beneficial to them, which get deprioritized.
Right. That makes sense. Especially if there's pressure to surface something that's engaging, and then it could be, you know, a really important piece of content that who you follow posted, but there's, you know, some random person coming in saying something with like 400,000 retweets, and that becomes your feed. And, you know, there's only like 30, 40 things that's reasonable. And that's not a lot of slots, right? That was the amazing thing when I was, you know, kind of reading about the whole Facebook algorithm with the AI safety is that the amount of information you can actually get delivered in the newsfeed to a person per day is limited to like the number of marshmallow you can eat a day, right? There's a limit to that. So it's a quota, like what do we put in your mouth, right? And that's a difficult challenge between the monetization, the viralness, the engagement, you know, keeping enough family and friendly baby photos to keep you logging in the next day. But you're right. It's very rarely for the user's benefit primarily.
The conservation of energy law that's true still for Web3 that is true for Web2, though, is the finite nature of attention. There is only so much attention. Right. People don't have that much time in their day, and the time that they have is split more and more often between a lot of these platforms and a lot of these streams. So that is definitely the big game, is who can capture the attention first.
Yeah, it's like I live in New York City, and it's like, you know, there's no way I can go to every restaurant that has ever been opened here. It's just not a possible thing. And whoever get the restaurant, like my meal share in a year, it's, you know, in good shape. And then could be Whole Foods or somewhere that is cooking. But yeah, there's definitely finite number of things you can consume. And I think, you know, I find it the best when I can get someone that's like, oh, someone likes something that is not super viral, but could be insightful. Those are the serendipity moment that I get on Twitter personally. What is your go ahead. On
that note, one last thought is that, like, if Web3 succeeds, it will be because there is now a free market for the creation and curation of content. And if that's actually successful, it will dwarf any competitor that's an attempt at centralization, just purely from the basis that it will allow people to get better information, which is a competitive advantage for them. And so they'll leave whatever social community they're in to join this new community because of the competitive advantage of better information.
And then it's interesting that, you know, if you look at Discord servers or Telegram group, they go through this thing that, like, I'm exiting from this huge news feed into these kind of private feeds. And then obviously those things get polluted with ads and self-serving things, and then it ceases being useful. But people are always looking for slightly better curation, and curation, once good, is always polluted by attention. People want to buy into this group, right? Through ads or promotions, stuff like that. So this idea of trusting people that you follow and giving them incentive where the monetization is built in, you don't have to do something for someone else to get it. That connecting that line to the person who is getting benefit of it is something that I think Web3 is uniquely able to do. I know you guys work on, I just want to cover some of the stuff that it interests me when I was looking at it, work on a kind of like consumer-facing wallet technology that provides some kind of on-ramp for these type of economic transaction on top of the content experience. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of what your vision is on this kind of user on-ramp by way of what would be called in the field a browser wallet or even a mobile wallet? And why is it important to make something that is not just MetaMask style thing? What do you see in that kind of wallet experience that would unlock the potential of these type of curation and compensation that makes you curate more?
Big question. When we first started talking about the wallets, I got a lot of pushback saying we probably shouldn't build a wallet, both from investors and team members. But Kayla, my co-founder and our head of product, and I had this kind of deep discussion at one point where we realized that the best way for this to work is as we onboard people from Web 2, they need to have the right path. And so if we didn't run that in-house, like if we just gave a grant to somebody in our ecosystem to run the wallet, we couldn't make sure that that experience was as clean as possible.
Right.
Because the way that we see it, the target market for Koii is not the current people that are in Web3, which might be like 3 to 5 million people total, including people who just have a little bit of Bitcoin, but rather the other 7 billion people on the planet.
Right.
Especially the ones who aren't well integrated with Web2 yet, or who really are just coming into the fold and haven't seen everything and aren't that sure what they want to do. And so when we see this as like an onboarding strategy, we see this as like, akin to the iPhone getting you a portal to the internet, or as a portal to social media, for example. And so that means that the user experience of onboarding people and making it as seamless and easy as possible is really, really important, especially if they're going to be trusting us in any fashion. And so we actually have a mobile version of that product coming up pretty soon, I hope.
Nice.
Hopefully in Q1. And we see the same thing being true with the desktop node as well. So it's a matter of making sure that the user experience is really clean. The other side of it, unfortunately, as well, is that most people in this ecosystem so far are pretty tailored to one blockchain or one layer one. And so you've got a lot of Solana wallets, you got a lot of Ethereum wallets, and like I use Phantom, I use MetaMask, I use a lot of the main ones. But the thing that I've noticed is that for the most part, they're pretty siloed and pretty maximalist. And so you don't see a lot of cross wallet or cross chain wallet support. And what that means is if you're an end user, you end up having to have a wallet for each chain. And if you're using something that most people aren't using, like if you're using Arweave, which we were using Arweave very heavily at the very beginning, and then also Filecoin, to pay to upload things to those networks, you have to have some of their token, which means you have to have a wallet that's compatible. And so now as an end user who's trying to use a new social media platform, you might have to switch wallets like 5 times to upload a file to the website, right? Because you're going to have to pay to upload it to a storage network. You're going to have to then, sign that transaction with something and have some funds there. And then you're going to also have to go and make an on-chain interaction to post the content to add it to the thing. And then maybe you have to authorize with your DID, which might be a third key. And so there's all this different layers. So we wanted to make DIDs and delegated keys really easy. So our DID system is built right into the wallet. And when you go through our faucet, you actually verify some credentials as well to get free tokens. And so that gives you the beginning of your reputation that you use to run the node. So it's about keeping all these things in one place so that people have a consistent experience. The one thing I will say, though, is all the tech that's under the hood is all standardized and we're releasing specs on it. So the idea is somebody else can come along and build a competitor thingy that works exactly the same way. And we would love that because that means that someone else is going to keep us on our toes. We can keep it going over time.
I think there's the protocol APIs from day one, right? So if you can create a situation where the specification can be enhanced upon, I see, protocol on the Ethereum side, like Wallet Connect, gaining attention and taking away from that centralized Coinbase had a QR code thing, to their credit, that's where they started. But now you have a slightly more kind of like compatible regime that you can go ahead and iterate on it. I think it's really exciting to see evolution and forks, but also when it's good enough, everybody just agree that this is the way we do things. It's actually prevent some bike shedding, which is, discussing matters that is not pertinent. I think what's most pertinent when I hear you say about it is that the 7 billion people will use a mobile app. They will use browser plugins. God knows how many people use browser plugin. They find coupon codes to save some money in their Christmas shopping. And those are big distribution compared to Web3 MetaMask distribution is like way bigger. Those companies are worth a lot of money and being acquired for even more than that. So I definitely think that distributing to people who are not just Web3 native today is really the challenge, because right now is maddening. Getting MetaMask reset up on a new computer is harder than it should be by like 3 or 4 times. Even though I've done it 100 times.
To using the mobile app, like if you already have it on your computer, why can't I scan a QR code and import my keys?
Right, like WhatsApp or something, right? Or in reverse, like I already have on my mobile app. Can I use that as my end-to-end key to extend my desktop? It's maddening. And making sure that your token list and your configurations are aligned on 2 instances is way harder than it should be. So I just want to, as we get a little bit closer to the end of this thing, we talked about like the work that you've done, and obviously, we are interested in Web3 as the extension to the web that we see today. Like, what is your thoughts about what the Web3 ecosystem ought to add beyond what you guys are working on before we can actually achieve that consumptive era, that reach not just mass adoption of crypto, which is what it seems like when you say mass adoption. Investment class and stuff like there's one type of that option, but the infiltration of the Web3 primitive technology into everybody's day-to-day digital life without them knowing it. What do you think is missing beyond what you guys are working on that you wish exists today?
So in order of importance, I would say credit card payments, some kind of way for people to earn crypto without having to pay for it, because it needs to move from being an investment to being a tool, which right now it's very much not a tool. There's no free trials. You have to buy crypto to get in and try things. And if you don't buy crypto up front, then you end up using something like OpenSea, where they're taking a huge cut off of what you're doing.
Right. Yeah.
So the self-sovereignty doesn't work without having ways to get crypto for free. And then I would say the third thing, which kind of ties into those both, so number one, we need to be able to buy crypto more easily so we can use it to pay for stuff, like pay for application services and be able to rent things. Second thing, need to be able to earn crypto for the same reason. You need to have tokens to be able to access these networks. And then the third thing was you need to have a free tier within Web3, right? You have to have ways that you can use a decentralized social media app without paying up front. Which means someone else has to pay on your behalf, and they have to be incentivized to do that somehow. And there has to be layers to these systems that allow that to happen. And that's all of those things are really, really hard to do. I think the hardest one is the third one. So being able to have someone else do an on-chain interaction on your behalf without that person being a centralized server. Because otherwise the architecture is still very centralized, right? I know a lot of apps that are onboarding users right now, and they're trying to do this by getting all of their users to use their central custodial wallet so they can make on-chain transactions on Polygon. But it's not actually a decentralized network. It's not that transparent. And there's still the ability to censor those people down the line. So eventually there will be corporate pressures, and there will be revenue models that are at stake, and there will probably be, eventually some bad cases that will interrupt the user flow.
I mean, we're repeating the original sin again on Web2, which is that whoever is doing that fronting, that paying that bill, eventually the bill comes due, and it is the destruction of the protocol and the creation of a moat that benefits the original investment. Who do you think is going to subsidize? We know that advertisers subsidize certain things, affiliates subsidize certain things. Who do you think is going to subsidize this free tier structurally? Not just in Web3, but, in the way we remap the business models of Web2 and the people who participate in the traditional economy in Web3. Is it brands? Is it like government? Or is it like some new organization of DAOs that entire goal is to get people like free healthcare and then it's free crypto for usage, free sovereignty by way of crypto? What do you think is a source of subsidies, cross subsidies?
Ideally, it's peer-to-peer. So ideally, the way this goes is if you're my friend and I invite you to try out a decentralized social media network, and I happen to be running a node or I have a certain standing in the community, people will hold on to your files because they like me, or I'm going to subsidize your joining the network. In the attention economy model, the way this would look with our content collectives, for example, is that in a content collective, which could be as large as a social media network or it could be as small as a photo club, I upload content and I give the ownership of the attention rewards stream to the collective. And the collective holds on to any revenue that comes from that. And they can also run ads on it if they want to. They can do whatever they want. They hold on to the file for me. They're also holding on to the storage, and they have to pay for that storage for me as a part of the file. And they can choose if I get to join. And if I get to join, then they get to hold on to my files. And the split can change there, right? Maybe it's a 90-10 split where they get only 10% of the rewards. But at any time, I can choose to export my files and take them with me. And I just have to start paying for all the hosting at that point. And so there's a few different ways to look at this. The other way to do it is you do pay up front, which is why I say that the free tier stuff is an on-ramp strategy. It's a way to get somebody in the door so that they can start to earn the right to have those files hosted. One of the interesting things, though, is that there's two sides to the hosting problem, right? There's storage and then there's compute. And compute is all the indexing and cross-chain operations, all the stuff that we deploy. And that can be subsidized heavily by having lots of home computers in the network because that hardware is a lot cheaper. Because at the end of the day, like a home computer running a Koii node should pay itself off in like a year or two, ideally.
Right.
And so then it's free. And the node operator at that point might choose to start providing services to communities that they really care about. Like if they're in that photo club and they want to provide an index or thumbnail downsizing for their friends, maybe you just do that for free because you have a computer. And that shouldn't theoretically cost them anything that they would notice on their monthly bills. The second side of it, though, is the storage. So hosting big stuff, you can do a lot of that on home computers. Hosting is complicated, though. It's like very bespoke operations. Storage is extremely straightforward. So in a storage thing, you're basically saying, store this chunk of data for me that has this hash. And it's like a torrenting network, but for the whole internet. So Filecoin, I think, actually has this completely figured out at this point, which is pretty amazing. They did a huge ICO way back, early era, right when I got in. And they've just been sitting there quietly working away on this the whole time. They're up to 27 exabytes of capacity on that network.
Right.
Which, for people who don't know what an exabyte is, it's a lot of data. It's 1,000 petabytes. So it's like, this is like basically probably 20 data centers worth of storage capacity that they've got. And they're talking to people like the UN about where to store this data. Because the UN has a lot of data on things like climate change or war crimes. And they don't want to put that in a data center that's in a specific country. They want to replicate it all over the world and kind of keep track of all the hashes and make sure that nothing's getting changed. And so a lot of these networks are quickly growing in utility. And I think what Filecoin's kind of working on, at least what Juan's told me when I've kind of briefly had a chance to ask him about it, and what I've heard from a lot of their community, is they would like to get to the point where storage costs $0.
Right.
Because the price is trending down, like the raw price of hardware is trending down significantly. You can co-locate them in places where the electrical costs are very low. And in a lot of cases, certain types of storage might want to be subsidized, or that people might want to subsidize them rather. And so in those cases, a lot of things like the UN climate data, you can probably find some volunteers to hold on to that. And if you can, and they're willing to subsidize the electrical bills, it should be free. And we think the same thing could be true for a lot of the kind of compute capacity that's happening in the world. And so if you can make hosting and compute free for good causes, then everything else has to be subsidized by revenue. But a lot of things don't need to be subsidized because the community can subsidize them themselves. And that's a really powerful thing about Web3 if you think about it.
Yeah, I think the composability is not just about like tokens going into contract, but the fact that the same mechanism can be used for, brand subsidies. Like, hey, you get the brand giving you free token to buy the NFT, and then bootstrap you and you can load more thing. But it can also be nonprofit using that as a much more direct way versus just like writing a check and hopefully get to the right people. And if you're gonna make it data-driven things, and it's like, well, this grant will pay for all the data for the next 10 years. Kind of what the Internet Archive is really doing, right? But at a scale where the actual mechanism of putting a data center together is already there. It's just a matter of just add money and just like that. And that's why I feel like, when I hear the things about the Filecoin scale, that's definitely a lot more capacity than there's demand for. But the demand's going to come from the shift of the consumer experience. And there's just a little bit of bootstrapping problem around cross subsidies and paying and earning and taking money out. And I think that's very, very clear. And thank you for illuminating. I share your feeling that the peer-to-peer model is really the right model. It's just which peer in which subset and how each of those peer group may not be homogenized. They may have different orientation and things, and that programmability and extensibility is really that's important.
Yeah, I think that's where the reputation side comes in, right? Is that aspect of being able to know who the right peer is to work with. I think what you brought up about like brands dropping airdrops of NFTs and things like that, I think that's also extremely powerful. And I think that's kind of the third cost of running a tech company, right? You have engineering staff that you have to pay. You've got hosting, your storage and compute, which we know hosting and storage and compute and stuff can more or less be free. In some cases, we've even seen engineers volunteer to build things. I don't think that's an extremely reliable case, but there is a case where both of those things could theoretically be free for some really necessary thing that could occur. And then the third one is the marketing side, which I guess is what you're mostly describing. But I think the marketing is kind of cool too, because there's an option in crypto that you can subsidize your cost of acquisition significantly. So a lot of big brands that have done really well recently have had affiliate programs, like TikTok did this, and a lot of other companies have done things where they split the equity up amongst people who bring them in. And for a long time, they called these multi-level marketing schemes or pyramid schemes, and people really didn't like that idea that somebody else was getting compensated for bringing them into the community. But they do have a lot of power, especially in a down market when it's hard to come by funding. If you can get your community to bootstrap your reputation by going and marketing on your behalf, then you're going to grow a lot faster. And so you can almost do that one for free as well. And so now you've gotten the startup cost of a big tech company down from hosting, engineering, and marketing to potentially basically just equity for all the people that put effort. And that's pretty cool. If we can get to the point where that's possible, things will happen really, really fast.
Absolutely. And I think, multi-level marketing is a bad word, but affiliate marketing or even type of like conversion tracking that Facebook made so much money on is just tying the consequences, the actual economic model and the purchase to the chain of event that happens and making sure those people are fairly and non-fraudulently compensated. Blockchain is a good solution to that. Not necessarily everything on chain and checking 100 different, affiliate code before processing a transaction with a stable coin, but the data that's available and mined and analyzed can definitely build a much more transparent and much more fair, so that anybody can provide a reward, maybe the company and maybe the competitor, say, hey, I want to give the same incentive to your data sets or your potential customers, and that would be really interesting and certainly benefit the end user who's getting 2 coupons, one from the company and then the competitor coupon from a competitor, and then that's twice the thing. Why give that to Alphabet and Meta as a revenue and profit? Give it to either the user or better yet, the user's peers that curates the thing in a more fair way. So I think that's a beautiful idea of peer-to-peer and the practicality of understanding that money come from 2 or 3 different places, and we just have an opportunity to rebalance it in a way that's more healthy for Web3.
Yeah, and I think that you kind of just touched on how Web3 is going to eat Web2, in my opinion. So you already talked about how these data centers that they've built are not that valuable if you can take a lot of that hosting and storage and you get the community to do that. Yep. The other thing that's also going to happen is their advertising bottom lines are going to get eaten,
right?
Which is very scary. And if I was any of these large ad networks right now, I'd be very afraid because not only are sales dwindling in a lot of places, so those ad revenue models are not necessarily going to work as well when the consumption goes down, right? The advertisers can't charge significantly more. And privacy settings are now increasingly causing problems. So like Facebook had a gigantic problem a couple of years ago with the iOS updates. That like
do not track
the Facebook tracking pixel, right? And so now Apple's taking all that revenue and Facebook's sitting there like, what happened? What do we do? They're scratching their head. Where do we make more money? Well, we have to start our own metaverse now. So we'll have a place to run ads, right? That was what
pretty
they
much
did. And then now they put all their money into VR headsets, which is crazy because they know that if they can control the hardware, then they can control the ads. But at the same time, like what you're talking about, if we subsidize cost of acquisition for all of these new types of social networks and places where people are going to view content, maybe YouTube gets beaten, right? Like YouTube could easily get beaten by a decentralized video streaming platform if that platform had a really good user acquisition strategy that included the users and the profitability of the platform.
Yes. Not just distribution and scale, but distribution, monetization, and together. And that's really why a lot of people like YouTube the best, because it has that balance kind of the best. Even the TikTok creator model is not as good just as a deal as the YouTube creator model. So yeah, I think that's the active ingredient, that if you can solve a better version of that, there's nothing hard about streaming videos and encoding them. Live peer and other people working on some of the encoding aspects of it. I am confident infrastructure will get solved or is already getting solved. It's just a matter of creating that delivery to that substitution to the business model, the macro business model of how Web2 business run, and find a Web3 improvement with the primitive. And I think we've touched in the last hour on many of this topic, and it's just so great to talk to someone who see both sides and know that we haven't solved it yet. It is not a magic bullet. It's really hard to do user acquisition and attribution. Those are like, lifetimes in the Lumascape, all this different company and smart people working on them, and largely not really figured out. So we, there's more work to do here.
There's definitely tons of work. For anybody who is listening and trying to figure out who they should be incentivizing, though, it's definitely developers. So if we can get enough code boot camps and really smart people out there explaining and evangelizing this way of thinking, it's going to bring in a new wave of developers that will hopefully be the ones who will build this future, and then they'll teach the next generation about how to use it. The thing that's tricky about this is, if you think about how fast the internet grew, the 90s was pretty slow. And it was not that much fun. And most people didn't really make that much money, and it didn't work that well. I think we're kind of entering the next phase of this. We're almost in our second decade of this economy now. Technically we are in our second decade if you look at like when Bitcoin came out. But if you think about like the Web3 idea, that was more like a 2015, 2014 kind of era.
Yes.
And so we're starting to see that hit fruition. And like right now, Koii, we're going around, we built a lot of our tooling so it's compatible with JavaScript. So it takes the developer base from 25,000 Solidity engineers and 2,000 Rust developers, which is what Web3 looks like right now.
Pretty much.
It takes it up to 13 million JavaScript developers, which is onboarding like maybe another 200,000 a year through 20,000 code boot camps around the world that are all teaching like maybe 1,000, 2,000 students a year. And so that's a really significant pace of development compared to what's happening in Web2.
Completely agree.
Web2 space,
Yeah, I think the technology and the know-how and the will to build this, and developer all wants to make tools that are used, and there's just opportunity to do it in a way that even getting a job at Twitter or Facebook in its heyday is not going to compare to that. You're just putting a picture on one button on one app on one platform, and hopefully that will be your annual review for the year. But there's a lot of work to do, and obviously a lot of trust to rebuild in the world that we're in, adjacent to crypto, Web3. But I'm so incredibly excited about the technology that's being worked on that would allow us to infrastructurally put it together through the wallet, make it easy to use, and more importantly, create incentives that actually mirror and improve on the business model that we have to depend on, from TV advertising to online advertising to social media. What next is not about the specific models of newspapers and 25 cents to buy one, but the balance of value and structure. And at the end of the day, that's the programmability and composability of finance and content and infrastructure that's at that. And we're absolutely in the cusp of that.
Yeah, I think the cusp is the right word. I hope to see it accelerate very quickly in the next few years. It's
about developers, about the developers looking for the new challenge, joining on, taking your skill set in JavaScript, whatnot, and trying it in this particular new way. And we have a lot of ground to cover as an industry in Web3, and the land is needing all the talent it is. And thank you for your time today to illuminate on what your team and your network of participants are working on. And we just love highlighting that what's going on, and it's beyond the little drama of a couple of people, not updating their databases or faking some entry on the Excel sheet. This is decentralized ledger, share with all, replicate at the right ratio for different tasks. And I think we are well on our way to, I guess, the beginning of the second phase, the second decade is definitely the right way of thinking about it. And I'm excited to be on the journey with a fellow builder like yourself.
Yeah, if I can say one last thing, it's, if you just took the amount of compute capacity that's going towards the Ethereum network right now, and you took the replication factor down from 2,000 to 2,
right,
it would be a lot of power, and
you have a lot more you can do, right?
And that's all it takes. So we just need a bunch of engineers to figure out how to do that for 50 apps, and we've got a new internet.
Absolutely, so I agree. The compute layer that we have thrown enough GPU on it, we just have to do more than one math question per day. And go from there. All right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Al, for your time. And as always, thank you to the community for your time and attention as we go through the building blocks and also the use case and then possibly in the Web3. We are extremely committed to bringing this Web3 piece by piece. It's the web. It's messy. It's going to come together. But when it's done, you can't have anything else. It's the best thing that's ever happened in the web, and we're going to add to it. And so thank you so much, Al.
Thanks, Chris.